Okay. Um, the recording will be available within a week on Ollie's website. Would everyone please remain on mute? After the presentation, we'll have a question and answer session. Tonight, we'll hear from Dr. Ezekiel Flannery. We'll discuss the comparison between diets of Native Americans in the Calumet region with those of early European settlers. Thank you for, and then he's all ready. So Ezekiel, you can take it from here. Just a second, there's a Jane Healy. Do you have a question before we start?
I do. I just had a question. Like you had said, how you've said the last couple of times we've had meetings that you can get educational credit if you live in Indiana, if you're a teacher, but you can't in Illinois. And I'm just going to encourage you to really try to get that going again in Illinois. It's just a matter of filling out some paperwork, and I can talk to you about that separately, Michael, but we need those CPDUs. Teachers need those. So.
Well, I know I have to get someone. Well, yeah, let's talk about that. I have some problems with that, Jane, but
okay. Thank you. That's it.
Okay, thank you. And so Ezekiel, you can start now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.
Making sure that everyone can hear me okay. Hopefully it's all right. Got my video working here. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here to talk about this. I generally enjoy giving presentations in person, but I always will jump at an opportunity to present on this research that I've been working on really for the past, let's see, since 2007, 2008. Just a little bit about me. I have a PhD in the sociology of food and nutrition from the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. Much of my PhD research was conducted in Mexico with different local indigenous communities there, Popoluca, Mixtec, and Zapotec. Mostly in the state of Veracruz. I also worked in Mexico City for quite a while. Fast forward to returning to Northwest Indiana, which is really where I consider myself from, although I've lived in other places. I was asked in Mexico by a lot of the people I was working with on food and nutrition in rural areas what I knew of the area where I'm from. And in 2005, 2006, I really knew absolutely, well, very, very little about the indigenous foodways of the area where I was from, where I'm from, Northwest Indiana. And since then, I've really worked hard to educate myself and work with the plants and the animals of the Calumet region to learn more from them, and also with different tribal cultures in the Great Lakes region. So that's just a little bit about me. Last year I was in Mexico doing some research. The year before I was in Peru. And it's very interesting to note throughout my presentation, I'll talk a little bit about the exchange and the interconnectedness between the Native American cultures of Mexico, Peru, and Northwest Indiana. Of course, long before the Europeans came to North America and South America, there were extensive trade networks. And on those trade networks, of course, seeds and other foods were exchanged. Those exchange networks and trade networks tend to be absent from a lot of our discussions and a lot of our textbooks, frankly. So something that I would like to see change in the next couple of years. So let me move on here. Let's see if I can get my slide to move forward. Sometimes I think I went into mute there. Let's see here. I click on there we go. So first of all, I always like to begin with where we are. And I'm always amazed at how biodiverse Northwest Indiana is. This is just a quote from the EPA from 1999. Although it is undoubtedly still the richest region in Indiana and in the Great Lakes Basin in terms of biodiversity, Northwest Indiana ecosystems are fragmented and under constant diverse stress from multiple sources. Without restoration of ecosystem functions and structures, their long-term viability is severely threatened. For all of us who live here, we face this, right? Lake and Porter counties together form one of the most densely biodiverse regions in the country, as you can see on the bottom. And I just want to take a look there at the map of Northwest Indiana. It's called pre-settlement vegetation, which is so interesting because I'm not sure how they got this vegetation information. I'm sure they looked in part at the land surveyors and the early maps, but just in my area alone, in the Miller area, it's so densely biodiverse and the ecosystems change so quickly that a map of this scale really doesn't do us a whole lot of good. Although it does bring out the intense biodiversity of Northwest Indiana from Lake Michigan, just a few miles inland. And there you do have, this is what I do like about it, it highlights prairie, dune and swale, water, swamp, bog, fen, dune complex, forest, savanna, marsh. And those were all areas that produced food that the Potawatomi, the Miami, and other native tribes produced in this area, used those particular ecosystems to produce food, cultivated and uncultivated. I'll talk about that in just a minute. So these are the areas in Northwest Indiana that I've worked at most, or in most, the Indiana Dunes, within the Indiana Dunes, Long Lake. I've started working a lot. Yes, sir.
You're not moving the slides.
No, I'm still on this slide, actually.
On the first slide, okay.
Yeah, I'm still talking about that list. Oh, did the slide move into the map or no?
No, it didn't move into the map. We're just looking at your.
Oh, thank you so much. Let me see if I can unpause that. Stop. Let me see here.
Because you're talking about all these cool ecosystems, and I'm like, we can't see the map.
Yeah. No, let me see if I can stop.
No map showing.
Share the screen here. There we go. Thank you so much for interrupting me there. All right. So now, can you see?
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So yeah, so there we have just a map of Porter and Lake County. And again, this is called pre-settlement vegetation. And there you can see just what I really like about this map, and I'll just highlight that once more, is that it does bring out some of the most important ecosystems in Northwest Indiana. And in a few minutes, I'll start talking about how specifically the Potawatomi, but also other tribes that lived in this area, used those particular ecosystems to cultivate crops and to produce food. So, and then at the top, you can see those are kind of the long list of places that I've worked with in Northwest Indiana and I've also surveyed them in terms of what foods are available now, and looked at them historically and researched what foods were available at the time of settlement. Is a very difficult term. I don't like that term, but the arrival of European residents maybe is a better description. So let's see if I can move on here to the next slide. Yeah, so I just want to highlight this, make sure it's in everybody's mind that this area was connected, as was all of the Americas had intense, extended trade networks. And for me, that was kind of exciting to learn about, and I think it's impactful to share that over and over again. So wherever I present, I try to share a little bit. In our area, we were connected to the Arctic, to the Atlantic, to the Pacific, and obviously to Mexico through the south. And that was both through land trails and through water trails, right? So there was an extensive network of water highways and an extensive network of land trails. In Northwest Indiana, we have, I think, 64 trails that were here, and they went to all different parts of, to the east, to the south, to the west, and well, to the north, because there's Lake Michigan. They went around Lake Michigan for sure. So yeah, just to highlight this, and this is also something that is important when we think about the arrival of corn and how corn historically it originated from most accounts in parts of Mexico, and then was slowly traded north and engineered to grow in colder climates, in different climates, in a range of climates. And today we have Native Americans cultivating corn all the way up to Winnipeg, which is just amazing. And it's an amazing story of seed sharing and knowledge sharing that happened before the arrival of Europeans. So now I just want to tell you a little bit about how I conducted my research, how I conduct it. If any of you are interested in looking at that or talking to me more, started out with some local land surveys, looked at some of the early maps, written historical accounts. All of those that I found written were from Euro-American perspectives. I looked at old settler meeting notes, which were really exciting. I spent a lot of time in the Calumet archives about 10 years ago at IUN. Oral interviews and conversations with Native Americans and non-natives. That was huge when I started having conversations with Potawatomi women and men, and Miami women and men, Ojibwe women and men, Menominee women and men. About 15 years ago, I started to participate in many different workshops that were led by the Potawatomi in Miami, in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Indiana. I also have taken ongoing Potawatomi language and culture classes from out of Michigan and out of Wisconsin. And I've some of the there's very recent written research conducted with tribal elders and or published by authors with elders' approval. In a lot of Native communities, it's elders are the holders of knowledge. They actually are in our communities too, but they're often not recognized as such. But in traditional tribal communities, elders are recognized as the holders of knowledge and cultural knowledge. And therefore, you need the approval of elders in many cases to publish something. So the research that I have used for this presentation was approved by tribal elders, and work with indigenous communities in Mexico and Peru. And chinampas and milpas are two terms that I assume some people on here are Spanish speakers. Chinampa is a type of aquaculture that's thousands of years old, aquaculture, where they grow on the water, and they actually, in Mexico City and other parts of the Americas, they create islands to harness nutrients and to create just a wonderful, rich, nutrient-dense soil to grow crops on top of the water, which I'm going to suggest possibly used to happen in Wolf Lake and other places here. Milpas is another very interesting term that we need to think about, which is the intercropped gardens of all of the Americas, corn, squash, and beans growing together, but with many others. So that's what I mean by milpas. And then I think in the bottom, I can barely see, but agriculture experiment stations. Throughout the Americas, there were areas that were intensely biodiverse, like, for example, the Indiana Dunes, where multiple tribes, in the case of the Indiana Dunes, it was dozens of tribes, came, worked together, and developed, experimented, and engineered, grew, used an abundance of different plants. So this, I just experienced, I spent some time in Peru, in an area outside of Cusco that also has one of these agricultural experimental stations. It was specifically agricultural there in Peru. In the Indiana Dunes, it was more focused on medicine. Then, well, there were a lot of edible plants also there. But okay, so that's a little bit about my research. Now I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the foodways of Northwest Indiana kind of looked like. I'm going to talk about the Potawatomi in the present because they are very much alive, and their culture is regenerating, and I don't want to make it sound, they are not part of the past. They are part of the past, but they're also part of the present and the future. They hold a lot of interesting ideas that will help us as we struggle for creating a better, more sustainable way of producing food and just living. So just quickly, some points about the Potawatomi that I've learned over the years. In Northwest Indiana, food was definitely and is a central part of the culture and community. The months of the year, in fact, most months of the year represent or are about food making activities. So I'll show you some of those months in a minute. And food is also a central part of ceremony. Traditional foods here come from plants, trees, animals, birds, fungi, insects, etc. And all of these were used. Food production in Northwest Indiana, because of our incredibly diverse ecosystems, we were able to produce food on prairies, in water, on wetlands, in marshes, in swamps, in forests, just a wide range. And I'll go over some of the specifics of how food production looked before European arrival and at the point of European arrival, actually. So the plants can be obviously perennial, annual, and biennial. Food is prepared and stored naturally. So drying, smoking, seasoning with local, for example, sumac, sassafras, bee balm, wild oregano, horseman. There's tons of different seasonings that we have in Northwest Indiana. In fact, with our biodiversity, we should have one of the most culinarily rich places in the we should have one of the most gastronomically diverse and rich traditions, just because of the wide range of plants that we have. Grilled containers made of ash, etc., of different birch bark and other natural materials. And then food in the Potawatomi tradition, and when the European residents arrived or immigrants arrived, food is local and was local, organic, and seasonal. Catchwords now. But the options for the Potawatomi, the Miami, were always constantly enriched through those trade networks. Again, I want to just emphasize over and over again that tribes were exchanging and trading for thousands of years. It wasn't just when the Europeans came. So interesting. And let's move on, see if I can move on to that next screen here. There we go. So just to give you an example, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Potawatomi. I really can't see a list of everyone who's here, but I thought it would be useful to go over a little bit of the calendar. And it's the calendar as I have learned it. And it's interesting because each Potawatomi community, depending upon the exact location where they are, would have different months of the year, would have different names for the moons of the year, because the climates would change. So for example, whereas here, maple syrup making could happen in early March, or even now it could happen in late February, but traditionally maybe early March. Farther north, it would happen in early April. So just interesting to note that. So most months are named after a food producing activity. And Bodewadmimwen is how I've learned to say the word Potawatomi. That's Potawatomi language. Bodewadmi is Potawatomi. Mwen is language. So Bodewadmimwen. And so they have a month called, or a moon called Zizbak Dokegizes, which would be sugar making moon or maple syrup making moon. And the sugar was generally made into a crystal so that it could be packed. Sure, some of the water was drunk, some was made into vinegar, but a lot of it was made into crystals, so it could be packed and traded. Then there's Gteganke Jesus. Gtegan is a garden. Gteganke is making a garden. So making a garden moon. And that would be milpa planting, right? That would be corn, squash, beans, and then all the beautiful volunteer plants that come up. Demin Gizis, Demin would be heartberry moon or strawberry moon. Minke Gizis, blueberry or huckleberry gathering. And then one of ours in Northwest Indiana, I would venture to say one of the most, well, I don't want to say that actually, but an extremely important moon of the year was Menominke Gizis, wild rice making moon. Northwest Indiana has traditionally some of the richest wild rice beds in the country. I'll show you a map. Some Potawatomi researchers, some young, really active, engaged Potawatomi researchers are starting to map out where the traditional beds of wild rice were in Northwest Indiana. And it turns out that Northwest Indiana is indeed one of the densest wild rice places traditionally anywhere. In fact, there are at least 3 native varieties of wild rice in our area. That's highly unusual, it's highly biodiverse. And here, just going on, I hope you can see this all. One of the many different areas of cultivation or of food production was wild rice, these wild rice complexes, and they were throughout the region. And I hope you can see that map down there. I mean, it's not great quality even on my screen, so I can imagine what it's like on yours. But the green is actually the historic Monoman beds, and there are indeed some in the Wolf Lake area. And this is just preliminary data. My data, if I were to make a map, I would have probably double the amount. And then you can see even down to the Kankakee. You can see throughout most of Gary, Black Oak, along the Little Calumet River, up by the Grand Calumet. Miller Woods still has some stands of wild rice. It's amazing, despite Roundup and every other chemical that they might have sprayed on there, there is still wild rice, and that's a really beautiful thing to see. Yeah, and the wild rice complexes were designed, they were engineered, designed to sustain a wide range of birds, and this was on purpose. This was with intention, with traditional knowledge. I like to say indigenous science is a bit more holistic and a bit more inclusive. It's also a bit more empirical than Western science, because the science that indigenous folk, indigenous people make is done in the real world. It's not done in laboratories. So in that sense, I consider it even more empirical. Range of birds in these wild rice complexes, beautiful fish and mammals, insects, snails, and everything was designed to grow also with other plants in cooperation. One thing that we notice that's really distinct between Potawatomi and indigenous cultures is other indigenous cultures and European cultures is that cooperation seems to be the general focus. And when Potawatomi scientists look at the earth and look at the forest and look at animals and plants, they see cooperation, whereas in English and in European cultures, they tend to see competition. So I think that's very interesting. You have 2 people looking at the same ecosystem or the same location, and they're seeing 2 completely different things because of their culture. Yeah, just to go on just a little bit more about the Potawatomi gardening or food creation. Sophisticated milpas. Milpas are, again, that 3 sisters, often called 3 sisters, but I find 3 sisters, rarely have I seen a Potawatomi or a Mexican milpa with only 3 sisters, or even Iroquois Haudenosaunee up in upstate New York. Most of them have many other vegetables in them. And that's intercrop corn, squash, and beans in our area, with other vegetables, flowers, herbs. And then there's a whole series of what are called in Mexico volunteers. Here in English, we have a very impoverished word called weeds, which really just means that what we don't know. Weeds are, I highly recommend that people learn the weeds of their neighborhood and learn the weeds of their area, because they're often extremely high in nutrition and extremely medicinal. So yeah, sophisticated milpas in this area, definitely in many different parts. And some of those would even have milkweed patches growing by, sunchokes, wild quinoa, lamb's quarters. Again, the wild quinoa, lamb's quarters, those lamb's quarters is wild quinoa. And poke is another wonderful, often it's called poke weed, but another wonderful, delicious plant that's that comes up naturally here. And I just want to point out that the Potawatomi and the Miami are kind of known to be exceptionally talented. I want to say that most Native American tribes in Eastern North America are exceptionally talented gardeners. But because the Potawatomi and the Miami homelands, the traditional homelands included habitat for raising wild rice, a basic grain of the culture, and corn, they were uniquely complex, right? They had unique systems that it was very rare to have both wild rice and corn in the same area. So that's one of the reasons why I think the Miami and the Potawatomi are known to be such good gardeners. Also, yeah, so I think I'll move on there. So vocabulary words that we could use to describe indigenous methods of food production in Northwest Indiana. We could say organic, sustainable, biodynamic, permaculture, intercropping, controlled burns, regenerative, composting. These are just ideas that come up that were actually in use for thousands of years. It's actually the inorganic, the unsustainable, the unbiodynamic that is new to the Calumet region in Northwest Indiana, right? So actually, these are all traditional things. These are not new. Sometimes I feel as if Native people don't get credit for their care of the land and their sophistication and their knowledge. So I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that these are not new practices. They're coming back, and luckily, a lot of non-Native people are able to learn about these now as well. So again, organic, sustainable, biodynamic, permaculture, intercropping, controlled burns, regenerative, composting. I have a blank spot on the last one there, but so I also want to talk about burning, controlled burns. This was one of the ways that the Potawatomi, the Miami, and Ojibwe, many tribes in the Great Lakes area managed and protected and made the maybe the berry producing areas, but also just made the land more productive. Controlled burning was a very important practice. And then I just want to go through carefully the Indiana Dunes area because it is, I'm just taking a drink here of coffee. Let's see if I can put on my camera again. So it is still the most densely biodiverse in the Eastern North America, densely biodiverse, that is. I believe it's the 4th most biodiverse fall national park, but the 5th smallest. And I think it's really important to think about the Indiana Dunes is still sacred to, well, at least 20 tribes claim it as a sacred location. So if 20 are claiming it, there could be maybe 50 tribes that still hold this area to be a very important area to gather plants and to connect to ceremony. Let's see if I can, doesn't like. So the Indiana Dunes complex really quickly, originally from my perspective, went from the Grand Calumet west to, or originally from all the way west to West Wolf Lake into Illinois, but not Grand Calumet West. It was actually originally from Michigan City all the way west to Wolf Lake and into Illinois. And like I said, deeply significant for multiple tribes for time immemorial and today. An interesting study that I highly recommend that you look into was a study that was conducted in the Indiana Dunes during 2005, 2006, where they found over 1,000 traditional use plants in the Indiana Dunes, traditional use for native. They actually did the research with Miami and Potawatomi elders from a range of different communities, Potawatomi and Miami communities. And they divided it. The book is free. The report is free. I think it's over 1,000 pages in 2 volumes. If any of you have seen it, it's just something else. I mean, to make you just astonished at the biodiversity and the knowledge, the science that our indigenous neighbors have, our local indigenous people. It's unbelievable. And the nice thing about that particular report is it also has suggestions from elders. It's kind of rare to get published suggestions from elders of how to make things better in Northwest India, how to do things in a more sustainable, more sacred, more respectful way. So if you're looking for recommendations from elders, I would highly recommend reviewing that report. And I want to just kind of note that Northwest Indiana, especially the Indiana Dunes, is considered by some to be the birthplace of ecology. And I just want to put it in all of your minds while I have your attention, or maybe I don't have your attention, but I'll still put it in your minds. You can hear it. I think that we need to also recognize it as a unique example of incredible indigenous ingenuity, creativity, and connection. The Indiana Dunes has been used for thousands of years as a meeting place, as a place to grow out different plants, share medicines, share plants, share seeds, connect, commune, etc. The birthplace of ecology that European arrivals or residents found was due to the indigenous people. And it's strange that I haven't really read a whole lot of written reports acknowledging that. I would like to see that acknowledged. And then just to give you a summary here again, the local foods, and also these were the foods that our first settlers ate. So I thought about it and I thought, do I need to do a comparison? No, not with the earliest settlers, because the earliest settlers, the earliest people here were relying on the Potawatomi. They were not, the Potawatomi and the Miami, but the Potawatomi were not removed until well after the first Europeans came over here. And they were completely reliant upon a native production. So, so it was seasonal, local, organic. There were 13 moons, 13 different, I almost think of it as 13 different seasons, but I've also heard that there are 4-year cycles, so that there are actually 52 moons. So I'm not sure if they're 13, 52, or who knows, maybe they're 104. I'm not sure, but there are at least 13 in the solar year. Examples of some of the most commonly used seasonal plants. So for me, as I've tried to revive the use of traditional plants here, I have used the white pine that for food in January, or just, yeah, January, the northern white cedar, February, maple, March, ramps, April, and then you can kind of see all the different strawberries, milkweed, blueberry, plums, cattails, wild rice, hazelnuts, pawpaws, sunchokes. These are just the 13. These are just 13 that I thought, oh, it wouldn't be nice if I just went through the year and thought of some of these. So I think cattails could go in multiple places because you could eat multiple parts, as can milkweed. Milkweed, I think I'd feel bad if I didn't talk a little bit about milkweed. It's one of my favorite plants and it's one of my favorite vegetables. It is edible. I use the small shoots when they're about this big. I cook them like asparagus, boil them, put some butter on there. I eat the leaves until they're about this big, maybe even more. So I eat the leaves. They taste kind of in between I don't know. They're delicious if you haven't had them. They're kind of in between a green pepper and I don't know, a pea or something like that, but it's unique. It's milkweed flavor. And then you can eat the flowers. You can eat the flower buds. You can prepare those as if they're broccoli before they bloom. You can eat them when they bloom. And you can also eat the pods when they're just forming, when they're nice and firm. So milkweed is easy to grow and it offers 4 different vegetables. every single person that I've cooked milkweed for has started growing it. Not a lot of them had it for the butterflies, which I also adore, milk monarch butterflies and other butterflies. But you know, now that people like to eat it as well, there's even more milkweed in our area. So yeah. Anything else that I wanted to comment on that? No. And so I'll probably just end with this slide. I thought it might be interesting to talk about, I thought I'd just take advantage of this moment to talk a little bit about some projects, and particularly a project in my local neighborhood here in Miller, to restore some ecosystems, diversity, and to build community. So in the last during the last 3 years, I've been engaged working with my neighbors here on one block of North Hancock Street. Basically, the project started by me removing my lawn grass and planting a wide range of native plants. I did all that by hand. And as I did it by hand, I met all of my neighbors, some of whom weren't all that excited about it, but yet they were. Once they saw the beauty of the plants, I really focused on the aesthetics in the front yard, so that people would enjoy beautiful flowers. And yeah, so I surveyed. Here's just kind of the process that I went through to build community there. Surveying already existing plants and soil types in addition to resident animals, birds, and insects. Sharing food, medicine, and knowledge with neighbors. So last year, before I went to Peru, I shared a document with all of my neighbors of 80 of the plants that I had in my yard, many of which are called weeds in English. But nonetheless, I gave them all a sheet that had how I use these different plants. And I'll tell you, all of my neighbors have used some of the plants for different things. So I thought that was really interesting. And now my neighbors are, we're kind of mapping out what's in our particular, there are 12 houses on our block, and we're mapping out what we have and what we would like to have based on the kind of soil and the historic research that I've done. The kind of soil that we have, it varies because we're very close to the lagoon or the Grand Calumet River. So we have plums. We've planted plums, pawpaws, persimmons, serviceberries, pecans, cherries, apricots, red buds, maple, blueberry, strawberry. I mean, these are just things that we've been able to do in our block in the last couple of years. And we have over 100 medicinal plants too. So not all of them are native, and I think that I would like to really highlight that. One thing that I have noticed around the world is that people eat also for their ancestors. They eat, what that means is there are a lot of traditions in different families that have different recipes, the use of different plants, the use of different herbs. In the case of my family, I have relatives that came from Sicily, and I plant kitchen sage, rue, thyme, rosemary, all of those different things. So I do have mostly native plants in my garden, but I don't think of them as, you know, I'm not very strict about that, and I certainly wouldn't want my neighbors to feel like they needed to not plant for their ancestors. That would be a horrible thing. So yeah, so I just thought I'd share a little bit about that, and then I think we're at 5:45, so we can have some time for questions, and hopefully I have answers. So,
howdy, y'all. How you doing, Ezekiel?
hey, how are you?
Very good. I just want to ask you the first question.
Sure.
Have you been to Lake Calumet before, as well as Wolf Lake, to study ethnobotany, Native American ethnobotany?
So I haven't been to Lake Calumet. I really haven't spent much time on. And over the last couple months, I've started to go to Wolf Lake at least once a week. And I've been mesmerized by the biodiversity. not only within the lake, also around the lake. Is there something that you would like to ask, or you want me? Do you think I should go to Lake Calumet, or?
We could sometime in the future to discover Native American ethnobotany over there, and what they had over there besides the Potawatomi.
Yeah. And well, I'm glad you brought that up, like, because this area, Northwest Indiana, was always, as far as I know in my history, my conversations with Native people, has always been cosmopolitan. We've always had multiple tribes. It's not, even in areas that were primarily Potawatomi villages, there were Miami, there were Ojibwe, Odawa. It was largely cosmopolitan and local control. There was a lot of local autonomy. But in the Indiana Dunes area, especially that north strip, the coastal strip from Lake Calumet all the way into Michigan City, that was used medicinally. And I've heard time and time again that area was off limits for there were no wars. It was shared land. It was fully shared. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
I just want to show you some of my harvest this year. This is a Lenape white warded squash. It looks like right now it looks like a summer yellow crookneck squash.
Oh yeah, beautiful.
And I've got my Ohio pole beans, which the Miami and Potawatomi shared when they were in the Calumet area.
Very nice.
I also got some Potawatomi Wappa white flour corn, which I grew this year.
Beautiful. Very nice.
I also grew some whole chunk squash.
So Blake, how do you keep the squirrels in your area from eating all your corn? Do you not have squirrel issues?
I don't have squirrel issues at my community farm, which is at Urban Growers Collective, located on 89 South Mackinac.
Okay, I know the garden. Okay, cool. I just was curious. I've tried to grow corn in the past, and I just always lose it to the squirrel invasion.
Yeah, I mean,
I've got 1,000-year tobacco, which many tribes used to grow thousands of years ago in pre-Columbian times.
beautiful. And I'm just thinking about the question that came in about the squirrels. Just something that occurs to me is in the communities that I've worked with, planting extra rows of corn for the animals as well is something that's a common practice. But when you're doing it in a small garden, I would challenge just not to think about it as losing it to the squirrels, because the squirrels are so important to our ecosystems. And and I just feel bad when I have some neighbors that just get really angry at the squirrels, and it's just we're the ones that are at fault by building our homes too closely, I guess.
Yes, be imaginative in how we approach it. I get you. I do
Yeah.
provide a lot of water for my animals in my neighborhood and such, but
Yeah.
I always begrudge losing my.
I know how it is. Yeah.
Did we have whole chunk in Lenape in the Calumet area at one time?
So, are you asking me, Blake?
I'm asking you, Ezekiel.
Yeah, I mean, Ho Chunk and Lenape. So I know that those tribes appear on lists that I've looked at historically for connections with the Indiana Dunes. But I haven't I talked to a Lenape woman a couple of weeks ago, but I don't know. I could follow up with her. And the Ho Chunk, I would just recommend going up and talking to people and asking what their memory is. I really encourage everybody to try to talk to Native people as much as possible. Yeah. But thanks for your question, Blake. Yeah.
There's also Peoria, which used to be which are a member of the Illinois Confederacy, and they have ties to the southeast side, as well as Ho Chunk, which existed thousands of years ago, and so have the Sauk The sock.
Yeah, that's
sack
what
and
I
the fox.
was thinking, the sock and the fox as well. Yeah. Any
Yeah.
other questions?
Yes, Dr. Flannery, I was just wondering, did the indigenous peoples use salt as a preservative from a historical standpoint?
It's an interesting question, because salt is such a literally a charged substance. So the way that I would approach that is from the conversations that I've had with Potawatomi friends and in conversations at workshops. It seems that the traditional diet did not include salt. And so it was maple syrup was, for example, the most important flavor. So traditionally, no, the salt wasn't part of the diet. But then I have no idea when it became part of the culture. And it's possible that information in terms of the date wouldn't be even recorded. It might be in a story, and then what was I just thinking? Yeah, it's something like mullein, like the plant mullein that's been used, according to friends that I have, for a really, really, like, it's considered native, but yet some Western scientists consider it non-native, even when it's been traditionally used by Potawatomi and other tribes in the area for as long as they can remember. So just reminded of that, even though it's a little off topic.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions, comments?
I was gonna say, I was gonna ask, I think this is fascinating. How do we learn more? I mean, are there resources? You mentioned that you had done some research at the Calumet site for some sort of repository. This is
Yeah.
fascinating. Like, this is so cool. I love learning about this, and I would love to learn more. And I know we have so many native plants in the area that our biodiversity is really interesting and
Yeah.
distinct, but I would love to get more information about it.
Yeah. Well, I can certainly. I mean, I've been asked to do more and more presentations, more and more workshops, etc. I don't know a whole lot of people that are doing exactly this focus. But if you send me an email, I can follow up and recommend some other people that you could work with too. And there's very little written. And in fact, I haven't published anything on this. I feel that it's,
You need to.
well, it's just it's complicated, because as I get more as I learn more about the Potawatomi culture and I'm sensitive to their traditions,
Yeah.
I feel almost as if I need to that would need to be asked of me to write. You know what I mean? So it's because a lot of this is
Yeah, I do want to be proprietary or to take away their autonomy about how they're doing their.
that's exactly how I feel. Talking about it is one thing, and getting people to use plants in a respectful way, I think, is a beautiful thing. And also getting people to understand what was here and what could, because understanding what was here gives us an idea of what could be here again if we changed the way that we interacted with the water, the way we interacted with the land. And I think it's some days I think it's highly ironic that the cultures that that a lot of Americans tried to get to go away, or that they're the cultures that have the solutions that we need. How hard is it to turn to those cultures respectfully and ask them and admit what was done, and at the same time admit that their science and their knowledge of plants is vastly superior to Europeans in this area.
Hmm.
It's a pretty challenging thing to do.
Agreed. I just feel like maybe there's abilities to publish things online that are not
Mhm.
that are not closed, that are not, sometimes when you put things in print, it becomes very fixed.
Yeah.
And, maybe to do something online that allows people to participate and to share their memories. I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud, but
Yeah, no, I like that. And I was actually asked to do a couple of podcasts recently. So maybe bringing together, and I think the Dunes Learning Center hosted an Indigenous science an indigenous science series last, I want to say it was 2 years ago. And that was fantastic. And I don't know if it's still available, but I could definitely find the links for you and the recordings.
Do you do things? I mean, I know obviously your focus is Northwest Indiana, but I teach at a school that's like really, a couple of blocks from the Indiana border, and that's certainly in the Calumet region. And I think this is really interesting for so many more people to learn. Like in my community on the east side, it's very the community is a lot of indigenous people, though many of them are from Mexico.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's a lot of interest, and there'd be a lot of I think it'd be great if maybe we could do something at the public library or something that could open those doors and allow people to participate if you're interested in that sort of
I
thing.
would be very interested. And that's exactly what I found. I used to teach at a school that was predominantly Black and Hispanic, Prairie State College over in Chicago Heights. And in my sociology classes, when I talked about these topics, it was amazing how much interest there was. And because many African Americans also have deep ties to indigenous communities, present and historic, it's something that ties together, brings together Hispanic and African American communities. But it doesn't necessarily have to isolate those white students or those non-indigenous students, because one thing that I found really useful is to talk about the indigenous traditions in Europe that are still there still are people who are actively intercropping and thinking and working with the land from Sweden, and we're talking about mushrooms, we're talking about knowledge of medicines, we're talking about all kinds of different traditions that are still actually the immigrants that come from Poland, the immigrants that come from Sweden, even today, still have a lot of knowledge about. So if I had, class, it's an interesting topic. I think food is always something that draws attention, that's easy to talk about, but the indigenous perspective is something that really I found it works extremely well, especially in diverse settings. Yeah.
It's fascinating. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This was a really interesting lecture.
Yes,
Thanks.
Dr. Flannery, taking that a step further, is there any place where we could actually sample the food stuff?
Yeah, over the last couple of years, I've been able to provide samples at workshops that I give. But in terms of trying these foods, my dream has actually been to open a small cafe where I can actually serve a wide range of teas and get people to really recognize to try the palate, because the what would you call the terroir, the amazing diversity of flavors that we have on this land. It's outstanding, and I would love to showcase that. But for me, I end up harvesting some from my garden, some from neighbors' lands, some even from, I'll take an occasional pawpaw from Coffee Creek. There are many of them, or ramps. But the only place that I really see that has there are very few places that have locally produced local varieties. And I would really love to see over the next 10 or 15 years, farmers starting to redo the varieties of plums. We have 3, if not, depending on how you count, 5 native varieties of plums. Plums are incredibly prolific. We have pawpaws. We have all kinds of different berries. I would just love to see the native ones grown out. And I would love to see the national park allow people, including indigenous people, to actually forage and harvest on their traditional homelands that are part of the national park, which is still not allowed. So these berries, these varieties of berries, some of which are in the Indiana Dunes, some are around Wolf Lake. There are varieties, very specific varieties that might not grow anywhere else. And if they're not propagated and used and cared for, they might go to sleep or not be here for us. And that would be just a shame, given how delicious they are and how hard people worked over these centuries to develop and bring those varieties into this area. So
Yo, Ezekiel, you know Billy Warren, a Potawatomi lady who's an environmental consultant,
I sure do. Yes.
and you know any other Potawatomi and Miami folks.
I do. Yeah. Yeah. A lot of Potawatomi people I met up in Michigan and in Wisconsin, even in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Hmm. Did you want some connections or?
I'm I'm trying to help me to help me reconnect my ethnobotanical history of the Calumet area.
Yeah. Well, sometime, Blake, we can go for a ride up into Michigan at some point. And maybe because
Okay,
there used to be a Great Lakes Lifeways Institute. I don't know if you have you contacted them by any chance?
I've contacted them more than a few
Okay, are
times.
they doing anything now or have they stopped doing their programs?
I I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. Well, touch base with me. Send me an email, Blake, and we'll move on that for you.
Okay, and by the way, I just have some Native American ties through my late grandmother, Eva 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 Mae Fry, who was a Cherokee freedwoman who was born in Oklahoma from
Uh-huh.
my dad's side.
That's that's probably why your love of gardening is so is as it is, right?
I guess
Uh-huh. Your
that's
love of
that's
native
why
plants. Yeah.
that's why the Lord gave me such wonderful gifts to do to do wonderful things on earth.
Yep. Yep. I'm just amazed with all the things you've been able to grow this year. I can't believe it, Blake. So congratulations.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Yeah, hey, Dr. Flannery, I have a question, but first I want to say hi because I don't know if you remember me from back a- quite a while ago. I had a couple of Spanish classes.
Oh, I do remember. Yeah, I totally remember you, Richard. Yeah.
So I was what my question is, was there any difference in the diet that is known between the different tribes and anything with like any differences with the tribes, whether it's with their diet or with the timeline that we know of, like were they did they have a different time periods where it tended to be a certain tribes that dominated, or not dominated, but you know, were the major inhabitants.
Yeah, I mean the history of well, first of all, the diets of every traditional community, indigenous community would be slightly different. So everything traditionally would be based on your local climate and local available foodstuffs, right? So you could have a Miami village and a Potawatomi village that could have completely different, not completely, because there would be overlap with corn and with wild rice, with some of the fish. But you could have them be quite distinct, even in our area. If you think about, a village that might have been on Wolf Lake, um, versus a village that would be down in Valparaiso, Chigua, right? They would have, even though they might be predominantly at times Miami or Potawatomi, well, they would be Potawatomi more recently, and then Miami maybe mixed. They would have very different diets regardless, right? They would have very different diets because of their different climates and their different microregions. So I think that's the best way to answer that. The history of the tribal, if you're asking about the history of the tribal communities in Northwest Indiana, That's a really tough thing to research. I mean, you'll find that the Miami, of all the tribes that I've looked at, have been here the longest. But yeah, it's something that I would recommend if you're interested in looking into. I could certainly send you some references to get you started.
Dr.
Ezekiel,
Flannery, this is Mike. Anna Ortiz has a question in chat, and I'll read it for you.
Sure, go ahead.
Hello, I'm in Cedar Lake, Indiana. Is there any Cedar Lake specific facts regarding indigenous crops, botany, food? ? Just curious. Thank you. This has been a great presentation.
Well, thank you, Andrea, was it? And from Cedar Lake, is that right?
Yes, Anna Ortiz.
Anna Ortiz. Yeah, I actually, there were parts of Cedar Lake area that had wild rice, but the actual lake itself, the only thing that comes to mind just on the fly, and I would have to go and look at my notes, is black walnut groves and the red cedars. And the red cedars can be used for food and for medicine. So those are the two things that come to mind that I know have been written about. There would certainly have been many berries in that area as well, and surrounding the whole lake. But in terms of the specifics, I would like to just take a look back at my notes and get back to Anna about that.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to remind everybody that this is recorded. So those late, you were late. If you want to check out the first part of the meeting, they'll be available on my website in about a week. So, and if I know there are about 5 people that couldn't attend this evening, so they'll be looking at the video, I'm sure. So
Great. Well, and yeah, go ahead.
one more question, man. I just want to let you know that I've done my best to research Native Americans of South Chicago and the Southeast Side, and how we research Native Americans in different areas of our community.
Yeah, I mean, it's also one of the things that I don't know if you've done, Blake, is just start asking around. Have you found any people that are of Native? Because in my neighborhood here in Miller, I found 3, now 4 families that are Native American families that have lived in this area for a long time. And some of them don't really know a whole lot about their Native history, but some do. And all of them are interested in recovering traditions. So,
well,
yeah, go ahead.
I found out from Eli Susevich from the Field Museum that South Chicago was inhabited by the Miamia, Potawatomi, Michigan, Peoria, and Iowa peoples.
And
the Iowa were once part of the whole chunk, and now the Iowa are found in somewhere between Nebraska and Kansas.
Yeah, and the Ho Chunk are still in southern Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And yeah, I remember visiting with some in I think that would be interesting for you to go. Actually, one of the things, and I'll just say it to everyone, one of the things that might not occur to people to learn more about Native culture is to stop at Native-owned casinos and go to the gift shops, go to the front desk and ask if they have any resources for you to learn more about the culture. Because, for example, the Four Winds Casino out there in New Buffalo has a tremendous amount of information and there's just so much that you can learn. from the plants that they have planted, the way that they have the building designed, the artwork inside, and then the gift shop and the front desk. At least when I've gone over and talked to people, they've been extremely knowledgeable. And the same thing I was thinking about the Ho Chunk when I went up to the casino there, and they were having a native run homemade gift shop and exchange. And yeah, it was very interesting to talk to people in that context. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Blake, for your comment and question.
Thank you.
Okay, and Dr. Flannery, thank you very much. We had, I thought, a really good response from the crowd, and good luck with your research. I really do look forward to you writing something. And I think it's difficult, but you've been able to get a hold of a lot of the local tribes, and I think you should start writing something.
Well, I've definitely started, but thank you for your encouragement. Thank you.
Okay, and thanks everybody for stopping by, and I just want to when we resume in October, there will be a discussion on the history and future plans for the Calumet College. So that's the next topic next month. And thank you for coming, and everybody have a nice evening.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you.
All right, ciao, folks.
Thank you, guys. Very interesting.